Greetings. We're now moving on to Chapter 7 of The Search for a Nonviolent Future. And I would like to remind you that on our website, this book can be downloaded, and there are many other support materials for following up the study of nonviolence that it implies. So this chapter is, in a sense, the big one, because we are now dealing with the biggest kind of violence, which is war. And I think really when you understand the dynamics of violence and nonviolence, war isn't really the biggest problem. It's the biggest in scale. But the worst problem is the very severe dehumanization and the loss of compassion and reason that can happen in a person. For example, in the case of fundamentalists, when this kind of fanaticism group grabs a whole bunch of people, they can become a much more violent force than even armies on the march. Armies can be converted. But it is a huge problem, no question about it, and it's also the biggest objection. The minute you start talking to people about nonviolence, they will think of ways in which nonviolence cannot work, which is not a good procedure, but they do it. They will do that. And what they usually think of is the whole question of war. Maybe they've experienced one, or they think of World War II immediately. And of course, we will be talking about the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration. So we really are devoting 2 chapters to the question of war. And this chapter, I want to kind of get down to the very root of it. And start by discussing Mother Teresa of Calcutta, because she illustrates how an individual conversion can actually lead to a peace process on this very big outside scale. She was, as you will recall, given the Nobel Peace Prize, and for a brief shining moment, the world recognized that the core of peace is within the human heart. It's a truism, we say it from time to time, but she made it real. She made the world focus on it for a bit. And I haven't always been entirely pleased with the Nobel Peace Prize nominees, but I think that the nomination of Mother Teresa of Calcutta was absolutely brilliant. And as Robert McNamara himself pointed out, I quote this on page 200, she deserved the prize more than anyone else because she did more than anyone else to uplift human dignity. And this, again, has been a theme running through the whole book. And I think after writing Search for a Nonviolent Future, I was on a panel with psychiatrist David Gilligan, who told us that in his life's work with serial criminals, the one factor that he, as a psychiatrist with his scientific training, could identify as the biggest predictor of whether a person would lead to that kind of violence was their having been disrespected, especially in their early years of their childhood, and how many times they carry out acts of violence in order to get some kind of respect, which I would call a pseudo respect, just as I would call the kind of community of men in war a pseudo community. But it replaces, it gets in the way of genuine respect and genuine community. But to return to our basic point here, because Mother Teresa uplifted human dignity, as I say in the book, she literally lifted humanity out of the gutter, case after case, in Calcutta, that she definitely deserved the prize. And then, as if to prove that she was in fact deserving of the Nobel Peace Prize, even if we define peace more narrowly as pertaining to intergroup, interstate conflict, she went ahead and stopped the what was called Operation Peace for Galilee, the bombardment of Lebanon in 1982 by the IDF, by the Israeli army. She actually got a huge multi-party war to stop in Beirut just because they knew she was there. So she illustrates beautifully in her own person that the roots of peace lie within the human heart. It's basically a spiritual problem, and therefore it's basically an individual problem. meaning in the positive sense that an individual can do something about it. So I move right from there to discussing the question of mind, a question which scientists have been making huge progress with of late. Not that they've anywhere near caught up with what took place in the ancient wisdom traditions, particularly of India, but they've made a lot of progress for moderns and Westerners. And maybe kind of bold to focus a chapter on war, on mind, but I think it was entirely appropriate, and I hope you'll agree with me that it works and it can pay off for your students. Normally, any approach to war will talk about large-scale questions like economies and dictatorship versus democracy and militarization. All those things are factors, but they're all brought into play by a distortion of the human mind. And Robert J. Lifton, psychiatrist from Harvard, I quote as saying that it's a deformed human mind is the ultimate doomsday weapon. But not wanting to be pessimistic and not needing to be, I go on to say that more accurately, it is the untrained human mind, the undisciplined human mind, that is the ultimate doomsday weapon. And that's much more hopeful because, who knows what to do with a deformity, but we do know what to do with a lack of discipline. We discipline it, we train it. So it is in this chapter, dealing with the broadest scale of conflict and violence, that we talk about the most interior scale of the mind and how to train it. And I'm going to deal with this in two stages. The first stage is to talk about language, because language is a key to the processes of our mind. And we all know now how euphemism is used to make the most horrendous kind of violence possible. And militaries all over the world have gone into this systematically and actually generated ways of talking about the horrendous violence and the killing and suffering that they're inflicting on other human beings by sanitizing the language. So that's just one aspect of it, and I'm happy to say that in this particular kind of study, feminists have really taken the lead, because they've been able to show how patriarchal and sexist language that's used very broadly throughout the culture figures into war processes. So that is basically the scope of this chapter. I hope you'll find it useful. Having made that groundwork, I now want to go on to talk to you about what we can do on the larger scale once we've made this basic approach of getting rid of the violence systematically, scientifically, getting the violence in our hearts converted to compassion and love. So on to the next chapter.